There is a particular kind of rain that belongs exclusively to Cardiff. Not the dramatic rain of coastal storms, not the sharp, purposeful rain of a summer thunderstorm. Cardiff rain is a considered thing, fine and persistent, arriving without announcement and departing without ceremony, leaving the streets with a particular luminous quality that I have spent 79 years learning to read the way other people read weather forecasts. It turns the pavements of Cathedral Road into mirrors. It makes the stone of the civic buildings along Park Place look darker and older and more serious than they already are. It moves through Butte Park in curtains, gray on gray, and comes out the other side having changed nothing and everything simultaneously. I was standing in that rain on a Tuesday evening in late October outside the Executive Education Center on Newport Road, holding an umbrella that was doing approximately half the job an umbrella is supposed to do, and I was thinking about nothing in particular. That is the honest truth. I was thinking about whether I had left the kitchen light on, and whether the bread I had bought that morning was going to last until Thursday, and whether the particular ache in my left shoulder that had been visiting intermittently for the past 3 weeks was something I should mention to my doctor or simply continue to negotiate with privately. Ordinary thoughts. The completely unremarkable mental weather of a 79-year-old woman waiting for her granddaughter on a wet Tuesday evening. I was not thinking about hidden notes. I was not thinking about oak document cases. I was not thinking about the particular handwriting of a man who had been dead for 23 years, or about the way a family can fracture along lines so fine and so gradual that no single person can identify the moment the fracture began. All of that was waiting inside a shoe. My name is Beatrice Morgan. I am 79 years old, and I spent 31 years of my professional life as a probate judge in the courts of South Wales. If you know what a probate judge does, you understand immediately what kind of work it was, the work of settling the legal dimensions of what people leave behind when they die. Wills, estates, disputed inheritances, contested signatures, the extraordinary and sometimes heartbreaking complexity of what happens to the things a person accumulated across a lifetime once that person is no longer present to explain their intentions. I sat in courtrooms and read documents and heard evidence and made decisions about things that mattered enormously to the people on either side of them for 31 years. I tell you this because it is relevant, not because it made me exceptional. I was a competent judge, I believe, and a careful one, but I have no particular interest in my own professional legacy at this stage of my life. I tell you because it shaped the way I read situations, the way I attend to things that don't quite fit the pattern they're presented in, the way I notice when a detail is slightly wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, but wrong in the specific way of something that has been arranged rather than simply occurred. I noticed it that evening, outside the Newport Road Center, before Charlotte came through the door. The administrator who let me in, a young woman, efficient and pleasant, who had come to the entrance when I pressed the intercom, mentioned, in the conversational way of someone passing along a small observation rather than making a formal report, that Charlotte had been staying consistently late over the past 2 weeks. Not unusual for students in the final stages of a professional certification program, she said. But she added something else, almost as an afterthought, with the slight uncertainty of someone who isn't sure whether they're being helpful or simply strange. She said that Charlotte never removed her shoes in the student lounge. This requires a small explanation. The Executive Education Center on Newport Road has a student lounge on the second floor where the more advanced cohorts tend to gather in the evenings, a comfortable room, informally arranged with the kind of low furniture and warm lighting that encourages the particular mixture of intense professional focus and collegial conversation that characterizes people who are serious about their development and also, after long evenings of concentrated work, genuinely tired. It was, apparently, common practice in this room for students to slip their shoes off while reviewing materials, sitting on the low sofas, making notes. Comfortable, practical, unremarkable. Charlotte did not do this. For nearly 2 weeks, the administrator said, Charlotte had kept her shoes on regardless of how long the evening ran or how informally the session had become. Once or twice she had stepped out of the room entirely, to the corridor or to the facilities, and come back having apparently briefly removed and replaced her shoes alone, as if whatever was in the shoe needed occasional checking, or as if she simply couldn't bear the weight of it in a room full of other people. The administrator smiled after telling me this and said she was sure it was nothing. I smiled back and agreed entirely. Then Charlotte came down the stairs, coat on, bag over one shoulder, with the particular expression of someone who has been working hard for a long time and is very ready to stop, and we went out into the Cardiff rain together and got into my car. She is 30 years old, my granddaughter. 30 years old and already the sort of person who makes rooms feel more organized simply by entering them, not through force of personality, though she has that, but through a quality of attention she brings to everything around her. She is precise without being rigid. She has her mother's capacity for sustained concentration, and her father's, my son David's, habit of watching situations develop before committing to a position. She came to forensic accounting the way I came to law. Not because it was the obvious path from where she started, but because something in the discipline matched something in her nature, and she recognized it and followed it. She settled into the passenger seat and exhaled the long breath of a person who has been holding themselves together all day, and is finally somewhere they can let the structure relax slightly. She asked about my afternoon. I told her about the kitchen light and the shoulder and the bread, and she laughed at the bread, the way she laughs when I am unexpectedly mundane about something, which is a laugh I have always loved. Genuine, unguarded, the laugh of someone who is actually amused rather than performing amusement. We drove through the rain-soaked streets of Cardiff. Cathedral Road, then north along the park, the great trees of Butte Park, dark and dripping on our left, the Victorian terraces on our right, with their lit windows and their particular grammar of bay windows and decorative tile, and the elegant repetition of the late 19th century, confident of its own importance. Cardiff at night in the rain is a city that reveals its age. The layers of it, the Roman foundations and the Norman castle and the Victorian civic ambition and the 20th century pressing in at the edges. I have lived here for most of my adult life, and I am still learning to read it, which is one of the things I find most sustaining about old age. The places you thought you knew completely keep offering you new angles. We were perhaps 10 minutes from home when it happened. Charlotte had taken her shoes off, both of them, slipping them from her feet in the unself-conscious way of someone finally alone in a space they trust, and tucked her feet beneath her on the passenger seat. This is something she has done since she was very small. This particular way of sitting in a car, folded up, her posture relaxing into something that belongs to a younger version of herself. The shoes were on the floor beside her feet. We went over a speed bump. There is a series of them along the residential stretch near Pontcana, and the left shoe shifted across the floor mat and came to rest against the center console, against my side. I glanced down at it. I am not sure what made me pick it up. Instinct, perhaps. The same instinct that 31 years on the bench develops without your permission. The reflex of a person who has learned to notice the things slightly out of place. The shoe was a perfectly ordinary piece of professional footwear, good quality, the kind that Charlotte wears for long days of working. But when I lifted it from the floor, it sat differently in my hand than a shoe should. One side slightly heavier, the sole marginally thicker than the geometry of the shoe required. I turned it over. I pressed along the sole with my thumb. Something gave, slightly, barely perceptibly, under the ball of the foot. I set the shoe on my lap and kept driving. Charlotte was looking at her phone, reviewing something from the evening session, a small frown of professional concentration on her face. She didn't notice. Or if she noticed, she gave no sign of it, which is also possible, because Charlotte has inherited from several directions in this family the capacity to maintain a completely neutral exterior while being intensely aware of everything happening around her. We reached the house on Cathedral Road. I parked. We went inside, into the warmth of the hallway with its Victorian floor tiles and the particular smell of old good houses, a combination of wood and plaster, and the books that have accumulated in every room across the decades I have lived here. Charlotte went through to the kitchen to put the kettle on. I hung my coat, and I stood in the hallway for a moment with the shoe still in my hand. I carried it to the sitting room. I sat down in the chair by the window, my chair, the one that faces the park, from which I have watched Butte Park move through every season for 32 years. I turned the shoe over in my hands once more. I found the edge of the removable insole, a slim liner, the kind sold separately for comfort, the kind that sits inside a shoe with a slight overlap at the heel. I lifted it. Beneath it, pressed flat against the interior sole, secured at each corner with small pieces of transparent archival tape, the kind used in conservation work, designed to hold without damaging, was a piece of paper, folded twice, aged to the particular off-white of stationery that has been kept rather than recently purchased. The fold lines were crisp in the way of something that has been opened and refolded more than once. I unfolded it. One sentence. Handwritten, in a hand I did not immediately recognize, careful, deliberate lettering, the kind produced by someone who understood that this particular piece of writing needed to be legible and needed to last. If the Morgan family still believes the official version, open the Oak document case before Monday morning. No signature, no date, no explanation. I read it twice. I folded it again along its existing lines. I sat in my chair and looked out at the dark park and the rain on the window glass, and I thought about what I was holding. 31 years of probate law, 31 years of reading documents that people had produced under the full range of human conditions: grief, hope, calculation, love, desperation, the extraordinary mixture of all of these that characterizes the legal aftermath of a life. I know what a note looks like when it has been written quickly, in agitation, without full consideration of its implications. I know what a note looks like when it has been written with complete deliberation by someone who has thought carefully about what they are doing and why. This note was the second kind. The paper, the handwriting, the archival tape, the placement, all of it spoke of care, of intent, of a person who understood that what they were doing mattered and had taken the time to do it properly. This was not a spontaneous act. This was a considered one. The Oak document case. I knew what that was. There is a document case. Oak, rectangular, brass-hinged, roughly the size of a briefcase laid flat, that has lived for as long as I can remember in the upper room of this house. It arrived, as far as I can recall, approximately 23 years ago, at around the time of the death of Jillian's father. It came with a modest collection of professional materials, architectural drawings, engineering journals, correspondence folders that Jillian had packed and moved here when the estate was settled, and she didn't know quite what to do with the professional archive of a man whose final project had never been officially concluded. It had sat in the upper room, on the shelf above the window, for more than 2 decades. I had not opened it. I had not been asked to open it. I had thought of it, on the occasions I thought of it at all, as the unresolved professional remainder of a man I had respected and whose death had left several things quietly unfinished. I had never questioned why the case had not been opened. Families accumulate these silences. They accumulate them gradually, in the way that objects accumulate in the rooms of old houses. One at a time, each one arriving with a reason that makes sense in the moment, until you look up one day and the room is full of things you meant to deal with and never did. The Oak case on the shelf was one of those things. It had been there long enough that it had become furniture rather than mystery, part of the room's permanent arrangement. Charlotte came in with the tea. She set it on the table between us and folded herself onto the sofa. Shoes back on now, I noticed. She had put them on again in the kitchen. And she looked at me with the expression of someone settling in for an evening of comfortable nothing in particular. Then she saw the note in my hand. The change in her face was not dramatic. Charlotte does not do dramatic. But something shifted, something small and specific, a fractional adjustment in the region of her eyes, and I understood immediately that she knew what I was holding. Not what it said, perhaps, but what it was. "Where did you find that?" she said. Her voice was level, a little careful. "In your shoe," I said, equally level. We looked at each other for a moment across the tea things and the familiar sitting room. "How long have you been carrying it?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 11 days. 11 days. During which she had kept her shoes on in the student lounge, had stepped out to check the note alone, had carried this piece of aged stationery beneath her foot through 11 days of forensic accounting coursework and late evenings and the completely ordinary texture of her professional life without telling anyone. "Who gave it to you?" I asked. She told me then. Not everything. She didn't have everything. That was part of what made the 11 days so difficult to carry. But the essential beginning. She had been researching for her final certification assessment, a series of financial irregularities in historic restoration project accounts from the 1990s in South Wales. Academic research primarily, the kind of case study work that professional certification programs use to develop practical analytical skills in complex financial contexts. She had been working through archived municipal financial records, tracing the paper trail of several restoration contracts that had been publicly documented as incomplete or administratively abandoned. In the course of that research, she had encountered references, indirect, partial, the kind of references that suggest a larger structure without revealing it, to a preservation agreement that had been quietly set aside rather than publicly concluded. The references were consistent enough to be significant and incomplete enough to be frustrating. She had tried to follow them through the accessible archives and had reached, repeatedly, the same wall. Records that should have existed and didn't. Contracts that referenced preceding documents that couldn't be located. A pattern of administrative absence that, to someone trained in forensic accounting, had a specific shape. It was not the shape of negligence. It was the shape of deliberate removal. She had mentioned her surname in passing to an elderly man she had encountered in the research reading room of the South Wales Municipal Archive, a retired surveyor in his mid-80s who visited the archive regularly and who had, over several weeks of parallel research, become a familiar presence. He had been there, it seemed, for his own reasons. Reasons connected to the same preservation agreement she had been tracing. When he heard the name Morgan, he had gone very still. He had asked, quietly, whether she was connected to the Morgan family that included a structural engineer named... And here she said a name I knew, a name that had not been spoken in this house in a very long time in quite that way. A name that arrived in the sitting room of Cathedral Road like a stone dropped into still water. The concentric rings of its significance spreading outward before any of us had had time to prepare for them. Her late grandfather, Gillian's father, a man named Thomas Hugh Davies. Charlotte said the old surveyor had become very quiet after she confirmed the connection. He had left the reading room without explanation and returned 20 minutes later. He had pressed the folded note into her hand and told her only that she should read it in private and act on it quickly, that he was sorry he hadn't found a better way to deliver it, and that the Morgan family were the only people who could do what needed to be done before a deadline he had been watching approach for 23 years. And then he had left. And Charlotte had read the note in the corridor outside the reading room, alone, and had spent 11 days trying to decide what to do with what she was holding. "Why didn't you come to me immediately?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "Because of Mum," she said. And by Mum, she meant Gillian. Her mother-in-law, the daughter of Thomas Hugh Davies, the woman who had packed his professional archive into an oak document case and placed it on a shelf in this house 23 years ago and had not spoken of it in any substantive way since. I didn't know what was in the note, but I knew it was about him, and I didn't know how to give something to Mum that had his name attached to it without understanding what it was first. I looked at my granddaughter, 30 years old, training to read financial complexity for a living and already in possession of the most important quality that work requires, The understanding that some information needs to be handled before it is shared, not from dishonesty, but from care. "All right," I said. "We'll tell her together." Jillian arrived at 8:30. She comes on Tuesday evenings, usually, has done for years, since a habit established itself after David and Jillian's separation a decade ago. A habit of Tuesday evenings at Cathedral Road that had begun as a practical arrangement and become, over time, something more fundamental. She let herself in with her key and called through from the hallway in the way she always does, and came into the sitting room, unwinding her scarf, still in her work coat, with the particular energy of someone who has been in professional mode since early morning and is only now beginning to release it. She stopped when she saw our faces. Not because we were performing concern. We were both, I think, doing a reasonable job of appearing normally settled. But Jillian has known me for 30 years. She has known Charlotte since Charlotte was born. She reads us both the way I read Cardiff Rain, not through dramatic signals, but through the accumulated familiarity of long attention. She said, "What's happened?" I held out the note. She took it. She unfolded it. She read it. And then I watched my daughter-in-law's face do something I had never seen it do in 30 years of knowing her. I watched the composure that is as fundamental to her as her professional credentials and her particular way of moving through the world simply dissolve. Not dramatically, not with noise or gesture. It dissolved the way morning frost dissolves when the sun reaches it, quietly, completely, leaving behind something that had been there all along beneath the surface. She sat down on the sofa. She held the note in both hands. And then she looked up at me with an expression I will carry for whatever time I have remaining. And she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very steady despite everything else that was happening in her face, "This is his handwriting." Not a question. An identification. The absolute, unambiguous recognition of someone who has known a handwriting for a lifetime and knows it still. "Jillian," I said carefully, "the note refers to the Oak document case." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands. Then she looked at the note again. "I know," she said. I waited. "I've always known it was there," she said. "I put it there. I told myself I would deal with it when I was ready." She stopped. "I've never been ready." 23 years. The Oak case on the shelf above the window in the upper room. 23 years of Tuesday evenings in this house, of walking past the door of that room, of being ready for everything her professional life required of her and never, not once, being ready for what was in that case. Charlotte moved to the sofa and sat beside her. She didn't say anything. She simply sat close, in the particular way of people who understand that presence is sometimes more useful than language. I looked at the note in Jillian's hands. At the handwriting of Thomas Hugh Davies, dead 23 years, structural engineer. The man whose final restoration project had been declared officially incomplete and quietly filed away in the administrative record of South Wales's building history as one of those things that simply hadn't worked out. If the Morgan family still believes the official version. The official version. I turned those words over in my mind with the attention of a former judge who understands precisely what the word official implies and what it leaves unspoken. Official versions are produced by institutions. They are the versions that enter the record, that get filed and cited and referenced. They are not always wrong, but they are sometimes incomplete, and the space between a complete truth and an official version can be, in certain circumstances, very large indeed. Thomas Hugh Davies had been a structural engineer of considerable reputation. His work across South Wales in the 1980s and early 1990s had included several significant restoration projects involving listed civic buildings, the kind of Victorian and Edwardian public architecture that Wales had produced in abundance and that subsequent decades had treated with varying degrees of care. He had been known, in the professional circles I occasionally moved through, as a man of unusual integrity. Not the performative integrity of someone who talks frequently about their principles, but the quieter kind, the kind that shows up in the specific choices a person makes when no one is watching and when the easier choice is available. His final project, the one the official record listed as incomplete, had involved a collection of historic Welsh landmarks in the Cardiff area. The details I knew were vague, because the project's conclusion had coincided with his death, and the grief of that period had meant that the professional specifics had been handled by others and filed away before anyone in the family had had the energy or the distance to examine them closely. What I had never questioned, what none of us had questioned, because sometimes the questions that should be asked are the ones that arrive in the wrong shape at the wrong moment and simply get set aside alongside an oak document case on a shelf, was whether the official version of what had happened was the complete one. The note said it wasn't. I stood up and went to the hall cabinet where I keep the things that belong on shelves and not in drawers, the spare keys, the important letters, the small items that need to be findable without being prominent. I found what I was looking for, a small brass key on a short length of red ribbon, which I had been given when the oak case arrived in this house, and which I had kept, without quite knowing why, in this cabinet for 23 years. I came back into the sitting room. I held up the key. Gillian looked at it. Her eyes were dry now. Something had shifted in her. I could see it, the way I can always see it in people I have known long enough. The shift from being overtaken by a feeling to making a decision about what to do with it. She said, "Not tonight." I nodded. "No, not tonight. But soon," she said. "Before Monday morning," I said. "That's what the note says." It was Tuesday. We had less than 6 days. Gillian looked at Charlotte. Something passed between them that I didn't try to interpret. A look that carried the weight of their particular relationship, of the 11 days Charlotte had carried the note, and the 23 years Gillian had kept the case, and all the complicated geography of what a family knows and doesn't know about itself. Then Gillian looked at me. "Who else knows about this?" she asked. I told her about the retired surveyor, about the municipal archive, about Charlotte's research into the financial irregularities in the restoration accounts. Gillian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "He always said the buildings would outlast the argument about who saved them." I didn't know what he meant. I thought it was just something he said. I thought about Thomas Hugh Davies, whom I had known at a respectful professional distance for the years of his life that overlapped with my own career. I thought about what it means to build something intended to outlast yourself, to make something deliberate and careful and durable, in the knowledge that you may not be present when it is finally understood. I thought about the oak case upstairs, waiting for 23 years with whatever it contained, patient in the way of things that have been properly prepared. And I thought about the brass key on its red ribbon in my hand. Monday morning, 5 days and some hours away. There was a great deal to understand before then. And I had, sitting in my own sitting room on a wet Tuesday evening in Cardiff, the particular feeling I had learned to trust across 31 years of judicial work. The feeling that comes when a case that appeared settled reveals quietly and irrevocably that it was never settled at all. That the document that changes everything has simply been waiting in the right hands to arrive. I did not sleep well that night either. This is becoming a pattern in my life that I have decided to accept rather than resist. 79 years is long enough to understand which battles are worth the energy. Sleep at this stage is a negotiation rather than a certainty, and on the nights when it retreats entirely, I have learned to treat the wakefulness as time that belongs to thinking rather than time stolen from rest. There is a distinction, and it matters more than it might seem. I lay in my room on Cathedral Road, the first-floor bedroom at the front of the house with the long window that looks out over the road toward the park gates, and I listened to Cardiff at night. Cardiff at night in the rain has a particular acoustic quality that I have always found unexpectedly companionable. The sound of tires on wet tarmac, irregular and soft. The occasional distant sound of the city's nighttime infrastructure doing its necessary work. The trees in Butte Park moving in whatever wind had come in off the Bristol Channel. the sound of them barely audible but present, the way the sound of a large body of natural things at rest is always present if you have lived near it long enough. I thought about Thomas Hugh Davies. I want to be precise about what I knew of him, because precision matters here, and I have spent enough of my professional life watching imprecision cause damage to be careful about it. Thomas Davies had been, in the years I knew him, a structural engineer of genuine distinction working primarily across South Wales in the restoration and preservation of historic civic architecture. He came from Merthyr Tydfil originally, a detail that carries its own specific weight in the context of Welsh industrial and civic history, a town whose relationship with construction and engineering runs through its identity the way coal ran through its economy. He had trained formally, had worked across the United Kingdom in his earlier career, and had returned to Wales in the late 1970s with the particular focus of someone who has gone away and come back having decided where they belong. He was Gillian's father, which meant I had encountered him in the context of family occasions, the gatherings that a son's marriage produces, the dinners and celebrations, and the more ordinary occasions that accumulate around a family over years. He was a quiet man in company, not unfriendly. He had the warmth of someone who has chosen silence because they find it sufficient rather than because they find other people difficult. He asked good questions. He listened carefully to the answers. He held opinions firmly and expressed them with the economy of someone who has learned that the quality of a position matters more than the frequency with which it is stated. I had liked him. I want to say that plainly. I had liked Thomas Davies, and I had respected him and his death, from a sudden cardiac event in the spring of a year that had already been difficult for several reasons, had been a loss that I felt in the specific way you feel the loss of someone who belongs to the outer ring of your life, but who you had expected to have more time with. The quiet people are often the ones you realize you hadn't asked nearly enough questions of, and by the time you understand this, it is too late to correct. His final project had been, from what I knew at the time and what I had subsequently half understood, a restoration undertaking involving a collection of listed historic buildings in the Cardiff area. The details had been vague in my knowledge of them. I had been in the middle of a particularly demanding period of my own professional work when he died, and the practical management of his estate and professional affairs had been handled by Gillian with the competent, contained efficiency she brings to everything she undertakes. I had been present at the edges of it. I had signed documents. I had attended the necessary occasions. But I had not investigated, and I had not asked the questions I might have asked had I been less occupied, or had the circumstances arranged themselves differently. Now, lying in my bed at 2 a.m. with the Cardiff rain moving against the window glass, I found myself regretting this with a specificity that surprised me. Not the general regret of hindsight, that soft, unfocused ache that accompanies most retrospective consideration. A sharper thing. The regret of a professional who recognizes, in a situation she should have looked at more carefully, the signs that were present and that she did not follow. The official version. Charlotte's research had identified financial irregularities in restoration project accounts from the 1990s in South Wales. Not in Thomas's accounts specifically, as far as she had been able to determine. In the broader administrative record of several restoration projects from that period, a pattern of inconsistency that had the particular shape, to a forensic accounting perspective, of deliberate rather than accidental absence. Records that should have existed and didn't. The shape of deliberate removal. I had been a probate judge. I know what deliberate removal looks like in a documentary record. I know it because I have seen it in every conceivable context, in wills that were altered, in estate accounts that were adjusted, in the paper trails of financial decisions that someone had wanted to become invisible. It has a consistent character regardless of the specific context. It is too clean. It is too consistent. Genuine administrative incompleteness has a random quality, a haphazardness, an accumulation of different kinds of errors that reflects the genuine diversity of human failure. Deliberate removal is different. It has a logic, a direction. Someone had removed something from the administrative record of those restoration projects. The question was who and why, and whether what they had removed was something that needed to stay hidden, or something that had been hidden for entirely different reasons. The note said, if the Morgan family still believes the official version, still believes, present tense, as if we had been given information at some point and had continued to believe it, which was accurate. Gillian had been told, in the period following Thomas's death, that his final project was administratively incomplete, that the restoration agreement he had been working under had not been formally concluded before his death, and that the buildings in question had been dealt with through other administrative mechanisms in the years following. She had accepted this. She had not, as far as I was aware, investigated further. Why would she? She was grieving. She was managing an estate and a professional archive and the complete restructuring of a family configuration that his death had altered. She was doing what people do when they lose a parent. She was surviving it, and then she was continuing, which is the only available response and requires more than most people who haven't done it understand. But the note suggested that what she had been told was not complete, that the official version was a version, a partial thing, a shaped thing, a narrative that left out whatever was in the oak case on the shelf in the upper room. I got up at 4:30. There was no point in pretending sleep was coming back. I put on my dressing gown and my slippers, the good ones, the sheepskin pair that David sent me last Christmas and that I have come to consider one of the most thoughtful gifts I have received in recent years. And I went upstairs. The upper room of the Cathedral Road house is the room at the top of the first staircase, the one that looks out over the back garden rather than the street. I use it as a reading room primarily. There are shelves along 2 walls, a desk under the window, the accumulated reading materials of a long professional and personal life organized in a system that makes complete sense to me, and, I am told by everyone who has tried to use it, to no one else. It is a room that has always felt slightly separate from the rest of the house, higher, quieter, with its own particular quality of light. The oak case was on the shelf above the window. I could see it in the faint light from the garden lamp outside, a rectangular shape, dark with age, the brass hinges just visible. It sat between a collection of architectural reference volumes that Gillian had placed there alongside it when she brought it, as if the case needed the company of professionally related books to feel at home. I did not open it. I had told Gillian that tonight was not the night, and I meant that. What I needed to do first was not look inside the case. What I needed to do first was understand the outside of it, the context, the history, the framework within which whatever it contained would need to be interpreted. I went to my desk and I sat down and I began to do what I have always done when a situation requires understanding before action. I began to make a list. The things I knew. Thomas Hugh Davies, structural engineer, died in the spring of a year now, 23 years ago. His final professional project involved listed historic buildings in Cardiff and the surrounding area. The project was officially recorded as administratively incomplete. His professional archive, the oak case and its contents, had been here for 23 years, unopened. Someone, recently, had placed a note in Charlotte's shoe directing the Morgan family to open the case before a specific deadline. The things I did not know. Who had written the note and how they came to have Thomas's handwriting, or whether the handwriting was genuinely his, and if so, when it had been written. What specific buildings were involved in the unfinished project? What the financial irregularities Charlotte had identified were connected to? What the oak case contained? What the deadline referred to, and why Monday morning was significant? The things I needed to establish, the identity of the retired surveyor, the specific nature of Charlotte's financial research, the current administrative status of the buildings Thomas had been working on, the legal framework governing the restoration agreement, if one could be identified. I sat at my desk in the quiet upper room, and I looked at my list, and I thought about the particular nature of the legal instrument called a charitable agreement. I had worked with charitable agreements in my judicial capacity, They appear in probate work in various forms. Because people frequently include charitable instruments in their estate planning, and the intersection between charitable agreements and estate law can be complex and occasionally contentious. A charitable agreement, properly constituted, is a durable thing. It outlasts its creators. It has standing that persists through administrative changes and institutional reorganizations, and the deaths of the individuals who established it. It is, in the legal sense, an act of the kind that Thomas Davies's daughter would recognize from her own field of conservation architecture. It is the deliberate construction of something intended to survive. If Thomas had been party to a charitable preservation agreement, not just a professional restoration contract, but a formal charitable instrument designed to protect the buildings involved, then the administrative record of that agreement would have a specific character. It would exist somewhere, in some form, regardless of what had been removed from the accessible public record. Charitable agreements in Wales are subject to oversight by the Charity Commission for England and Wales. They leave traces. They require registration. They cannot simply be made to disappear, even if the people who created them are no longer present to defend them. By the time the grey light of a Cardiff Wednesday morning began to appear around the curtains of the upper room, I had the outline of what needed to happen. I called Patricia, not Patricia Okafor, a different Patricia entirely, which is a detail I mention only because it occurs to me that the women who help you in the most critical moments of your life are often quietly extraordinary people who happen to have common names. This Patricia was a colleague from my judicial years, Patricia Rees, now retired, who had spent the latter part of her career as a King's Counsel, specializing in charity law and heritage legislation. We had known each other for 40 years. She answered her phone at 7:15 in the morning, which told me she was already up, and she said hello in the way of someone who had been expecting the call, which was disconcerting until I remembered that she always sounds like that. I told her the situation briefly, the note, the Oak case, Charlotte's research, the deadline. She listened without interrupting, a quality I have always admired in legal professionals and found more rarely than you might expect. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "B, the Llandaff Restoration Consortium." I said, "Tell me." She told me. What she knew, what she had known for some years, in the distant, professionally filed way of someone who had been involved in a case at one remove and had subsequently watched its incomplete resolution with the specific dissatisfaction of a lawyer who recognizes when a thing has not been properly finished, was this. In the early 1990s, a group of heritage professionals in South Wales had formed an informal consortium to address the threatened status of a collection of listed historic buildings in and around Cardiff. The buildings were varied in type and period: Victorian civic architecture, Edwardian institutional buildings, one structure of medieval origin, but shared a common predicament. They were listed, which meant legally protected, but their protection was nominal rather than active because the bodies responsible for their maintenance had neither the resources nor, in several cases, the institutional will to undertake the restoration work their condition required. The consortium had, through a combination of professional networks and quiet advocacy, arranged a restoration agreement that pooled professional services, engineering assessment, architectural planning, conservation architecture, in a coordinated program that would bring the buildings to a stable condition without requiring the full public funding that the official channels would have demanded, and that the official channels were not, at that particular moment in the early 1990s, positioned to provide. This arrangement had been formalized, Patricia believed, as a charitable preservation agreement, properly registered, properly documented, with trustees named and obligations defined. It had operated quietly for several years, making genuine progress on several of the buildings. Thomas Hugh Davies had been its structural engineering lead. Then Thomas had died. And in the administrative confusion that followed, the consortium losing its central technical figure, the documentation dispersed across several individuals' professional archives, The institutional landscape shifting as it does in Wales when political and administrative structures reorganize themselves, the agreement had been allowed to go formally dormant. The buildings had been dealt with through other means, some more satisfactorily than others. The record of the agreement itself had become fragmented, distributed, partially removed from the accessible archive in ways that Patricia described as consistent with institutional embarrassment rather than anything more deliberate. The kind of removal that happens when an organization would prefer that a complicated arrangement it can no longer manage simply not be visible in the record. But the agreement itself, the charitable instrument, the formal legal document, had not been dissolved. It had gone dormant. And a dormant charitable agreement in Wales, under the oversight of the Charity Commission, has a specific legal status. It retains its standing. It retains its registered existence. It cannot simply be ignored. And if the buildings it was created to protect are approaching a new crisis, a new threat to their listed status, a new administrative moment at which their future needs to be determined, the agreement has, in principle, renewed relevance. "What kind of crisis?" I asked. Patricia named a development proposal. She gave me the planning reference number. She told me that a planning application had been submitted several months prior relating to a site in central Cardiff that incorporated two of the buildings the consortium had worked on. The application proposed, in its current form, a use change that would require modifications incompatible with the building's listed status. The application was under review by the planning authority. The heritage bodies with standing to object had been consulted, and the deadline for formal submissions, including submissions from any parties with legal standing under a registered heritage protection instrument, was Monday morning. Monday morning. I sat very still for a moment. Then I said, "The agreement. If it was properly registered, it would give the consortium, or its surviving legal successors, formal standing to object to the planning application." "Yes," Patricia said. "And without the original agreement documents, the standing cannot be established in time." Not easily. The Charity Commission records would confirm the registration, but the specific terms, the buildings named, the protection obligations, the trustee succession provisions, those would need to come from the original instrument, which appears to be in an oak case in your upper room. I looked at the oak case on the shelf above the window. "Patricia," I said, "can you come to Cardiff?" She arrived that afternoon. In the meanwhile, I had spoken to Gillian. She had telephoned at 8 in the morning, before I had had a chance to call her. She had not slept any better than I had, which I might have predicted, and she had spent the early hours of the morning in her own way of processing things, which is to work. She had gone to her professional files and pulled everything she had relating to her father's estate and his final project, the correspondence from the period following his death, the communications from the various bodies involved in the buildings, the administrative letters that had closed off the various threads of his professional life after he was no longer present to manage them himself. She read me several passages over the phone. The language of official administration, careful and institutional, the language of bodies explaining to the survivors of a professional why his work had been concluded in the way it had been. The language, I now heard with different ears, of an official version. "There's a letter here," Gillian said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone reading carefully. "From a heritage administrator. It says the restoration agreement has been formally concluded by mutual consent of the remaining parties." She paused. "Concluded. Not dissolved, not expired. Concluded." "Do you see the distinction?" I asked. "I think so," she said slowly. "Concluded by mutual consent implies an active decision, not an administrative lapse." "It implies," I said, "that someone made a choice about how to characterize what happened. A concluded agreement is a finished thing. A dormant agreement is still active." There was a silence. "They told us it was finished," Gillian said. "Yes," I said, "and perhaps they believed it was, or perhaps someone decided it was easier for it to be finished." Another silence. Longer. My father would have known the difference, she said. Yes, I said. I think he would. When Patricia Reese arrived at Cathedral Road that afternoon, efficient, sharp, with the particular energy of a retired lawyer given a problem that genuinely interests her, which is an energy I recognize because I have felt it myself, we gathered in the sitting room, the three of us, Patricia, Jillian, and I. Charlotte arrived from Newport Road at 5:30, still in her professional clothes from a day of coursework, and joined us without needing to be briefed because Jillian had spoken to her during the afternoon. The oak case sat on the coffee table between us. I had brought it down from the upper room that morning. It sat with the particular authority of a thing that has been waiting, not inertly, not passively, but with the accumulated patience of something that has held its purpose across 23 years of being left on a shelf. Patricia examined it briefly. "May I?" she said to Jillian. Jillian nodded. I held out the small brass key on its red ribbon. Patricia took it, examined the keyhole in the case's front clasp, and inserted the key. It turned smoothly, without resistance, the mechanism well made and well preserved, the kind of workmanship that a structural engineer would have selected with care. The case opened. The smell that came from it was the particular smell of old paper in a well-sealed environment, dry, slightly sweet, the smell of documents that have been kept properly and have therefore kept themselves. It is a smell that libraries produce and that archives produce, and that any space where paper has been honored rather than simply stored produces. And I have always found it settling in the way of things that are familiar from a long time ago. Inside were several items, organized with the meticulous precision of a structural engineer who understood that the arrangement of materials is as important as the materials themselves. Rolled architectural drawings, secured with conservation-grade ties, a leather-bound journal, the kind with a strap closure, a folder of correspondence, tabbed and ordered. And beneath all of these, in a sealed, transparent document wallet of the kind used in professional archive work, a formal document whose first page bore the heading that made Patricia Reese, a woman who has spent 4 decades in law without ever becoming easily surprised, audibly draw breath. The heading read, Charitable Preservation Agreement for the Protection of Listed Heritage Structures in the County of South Glamorgan, established under the Charities Act 1993, registration confirmed. Patricia lifted it from the case with both hands, the way you lift something that has standing. "It's here," she said quietly. "The whole instrument. Original signatures, witness attestations, registration confirmation from the Charity Commission." She turned to the interior pages. Named trustees. She read the names, 5 of them, professionals from the heritage and conservation field, most of whose names I did not recognize, but 2 of whom I did. Thomas Hugh Davies was listed as trustee and technical director. The 5th name on the list was preceded by the word successor and was followed by a provision I had not expected. The successor provision named a specific mechanism for identifying replacement trustees in the event of the original panel being unable to serve. It named professions rather than individuals, a conservation architect in active practice, a chartered surveyor with heritage experience, a legal professional with charity law standing. The provision included a clause that I read twice and then handed to Jillian without comment. She read it. She looked up at me. The clause stated that in the event of the trust requiring reactivation following a period of dormancy, the surviving adult members of the founding trustees' immediate families had standing to initiate the reactivation process, provided they could present the original instrument to the relevant regulatory body within the prescribed time period. The surviving adult members of the founding trustees' immediate families. Jillian Morgan, née Davies, daughter of Thomas Hugh Davies, conservation architect, currently in active practice. Charlotte Morgan, granddaughter of Thomas Hugh Davies, forensic accounting professional in advanced certification. Beatrice Morgan, related by marriage to Thomas Hugh Davies, retired legal professional with charity law adjacent experience. We sat in the sitting room of Cathedral Road and looked at the document that Thomas Hugh Davies had prepared, had sealed, had placed in a case that he had given to the family member he trusted to keep it, in the knowledge that he might not be present when the moment came to use it. And we understood, in the particular quiet of that understanding, that he had planned for this. Not for his death specifically. None of us plans for that with any real conviction. But for the possibility of his absence, for the chance that the agreement might need to be recovered and reactivated by people he would not be there to guide. He had made the document findable. He had kept it within the family. He had written a provision that named us, not by name, but by description, as the people with standing to act. Charlotte spoke first. He knew, she said. He knew this moment might come. He prepared for it before it happened. Yes, Gillian said. Her voice was very steady. That was him. That was exactly him. I thought about the note in the shoe. The retired surveyor who had placed it there after hearing Charlotte's surname in the reading room of the municipal archive. A man who had known Thomas Davies. A man who had been watching the planning application move toward its deadline and had realized, in the particular way of someone who has held a hope for a long time, that the family might not know what they had. Because we hadn't known. We had been living with the Oak case for 23 years and none of us had known. Patricia began making telephone calls. The Charity Commission first, to confirm the registration status of the agreement, which she found within 20 minutes, active but dormant, exactly as she had expected, the record existing in the way that properly registered charitable instruments exist regardless of what happens to the people who create them. Then the Planning Authority, to confirm the deadline and the submission process. Then the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, which had standing in the case and whose involvement would strengthen any formal objection considerably. Charlotte had opened her laptop and was working through the financial records she had been researching for her certification program, now with the agreement document in front of her, cross-referencing the buildings named in the instrument with the accounts she had been tracing. The pattern she had identified, the records that should have existed and didn't, the shape of deliberate removal, was resolving under her professional attention into something more specific. She looked up after perhaps 30 minutes. The financial irregularities I found, she said carefully, aren't evidence of misconduct. They're evidence of the agreement operating. She turned her laptop to show me the screen. Look at these transfers. The timing, the amounts, the recipient designations. They match the construction phases of the buildings named in the agreement. Someone was recording them as standard project expenditure in the public accounts rather than as charitable distributions, because if they'd recorded them correctly, the agreement would have been visible in the public record, and the consortium had agreed to keep it confidential. Why confidential? Patricia asked from across the room. Her phone held at her shoulder. Charlotte looked at the document. It says here, Clause 7. The founding trustees agreed to maintain the confidentiality of the agreement's existence and operation in order to protect the dignity of the institutional parties whose financial limitations had made the arrangement necessary. She paused. They were protecting the buildings, but they were also protecting the reputation of the bodies that should have been funding the restoration themselves, and couldn't. I thought about Thomas Hugh Davies, sitting in a room somewhere in Cardiff in the early 1990s, deciding how to structure an agreement that would save buildings he believed were worth saving, in a way that protected everyone involved, including the institutions that had failed in their statutory obligations and would have found public acknowledgement of that failure professionally difficult. He had built something designed to protect not just the buildings, but everyone connected to them. He had absorbed the invisibility of it himself, along with his co-trustees, so that the work could proceed and the buildings could be saved, and no one had to be publicly embarrassed by the gap between what they should have done and what they had managed to do. And then he had died before the agreement could be formally concluded. And in the resulting administrative difficulty, the official version had become the only version. The buildings had been managed, partially, through other means. The agreement had gone dormant. The records had been shaped by people who found the original arrangement easier to set aside than to explain. And the buildings he had worked to save were now facing a planning application that would permanently alter two of them, and the deadline was Monday morning, and the only instrument withstanding to formally object was the one that had been sitting in a brass-keyed oak case on a shelf in this house. Patricia finished her call. She came back to the table with the particular expression of a lawyer who has confirmed what she needed to confirm. "The registration is active," she said. "The agreement has standing. With the original instrument and a formal submission from the trustees' successors, we can file an objection that will have full legal weight." She looked at each of us in turn. "We have 4 days." Jillian reached across the table and placed her hand flat on the cover of the agreement document, not dramatically, simply. The gesture of a person making contact with something they have not been able to touch for a very long time. "He built this for us," she said quietly. "Even then, even when he couldn't have known." Charlotte looked at her mother-in-law across the table with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Something that was not quite new, but was the fuller version of something I had only seen partially. The expression of a professional who has found that the thing she has been trained to find is not an abstraction but something real and personal and worth every bit of the work it took to locate it. But it was what I noticed then, in the gap between Charlotte's expression and the document on the table. That stopped me, because Charlotte had turned back to her laptop, and what she was looking at was not the financial records she had been cross-referencing. She had opened a different file, an archival scan I hadn't seen before, and from where I was sitting, I could see enough of it to understand that it was a letter, handwritten. On stationery, I recognized from the note in the shoe, and the expression on Charlotte's face was not the expression of someone who has found a piece of supporting evidence. It was the expression of someone who has found something they were not expecting, something that had nothing to do with the buildings, something that was going to require a different kind of conversation entirely. I have spent a great deal of my professional life learning to read faces, not in the dramatic sense that certain television programs would have you believe, not the reading of micro-expressions or the detection of deception through involuntary muscle movements or any of the other techniques that popular culture has decided constitute expertise in human behavior. What 31 years on the bench actually teaches you is something quieter and more reliable than that. It teaches you to notice the difference between a person's ordinary face and the face they produce when something has shifted inside them that they haven't yet decided how to handle. Charlotte's face, in that moment, was the second kind. She was looking at her laptop screen with the particular stillness of someone who has just read something that requires immediate recalibration of everything they thought they understood about the situation they were in. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the keyboard. She was not moving. She was not reading further. She was sitting with what she had found in the way that you sit, with something that has landed harder than you expected, and that you need a moment to absorb before you can do anything useful with it. Patricia was still making notes. Jillian was reading through the correspondence folder from the oak case, working through the tabbed sections with the systematic attention of a conservation architect reviewing a structural report, methodically, without rushing, giving each document its proper weight. Neither of them had noticed Charlotte's expression change. I had. I did not say anything immediately. This is a discipline I developed over decades of judicial work, the understanding that the moment between a discovery and its articulation is often the most important moment, and that interrupting it prematurely almost always produces less information than waiting does. I watched Charlotte. I waited. After perhaps 2 minutes, which is a long time, in a room full of people doing focused work, to be completely still, she looked up. She looked at me. And I saw in her eyes the particular combination of things that I recognized from the faces of people who have found information that is important and true, and that they are not sure how to give to someone they love without causing a particular kind of pain. I gave the smallest possible nod, the nod that means, I see you. Take your time. She looked back at the screen. She closed the laptop partially, not fully, but enough to reduce the visibility of the screen to anyone approaching from the side. She picked up her tea, which had gone cold. She held it in both hands the way people hold cups when they need something to do with their hands, while their mind does something entirely different. Patricia finished her notes and looked up. "I'll need to contact the land registry for Wales first thing tomorrow morning," she said. "The buildings are listed, and the registry will have records of any planning conditions attached to the listing that would strengthen the objection." She looked at Jillian. "Do you have any record of the specific listing grades for the buildings named in the agreement?" Jillian turned to the correspondence folder. "There should be something here. My father was meticulous about documentation." She found the relevant section and began reading. Grade 2 starred for the Edwardian building on Westgate Street. Grade 2 for the Victorian terrace on Charles Street. The medieval structure, she paused, is Grade 1 listed. Patricia made a sound of quiet, professional satisfaction. Grade 1 gives us considerably stronger standing. The planning authority has a higher burden of justification for any application affecting a Grade 1 listed structure. Combined with a formal objection from a registered charitable preservation instrument, the application is going to face serious scrutiny. She said it with the confidence of someone who has spent 4 decades making exactly these calculations, and I found it settling in the way that competent certainty always is. But the settling was partial, because Charlotte was still holding her cold tea and her laptop was still half closed, and the thing she had found was still sitting between us in the unspoken way of things that are real and present, even when they haven't been given words yet. "Jillian," I said, "could you take Patricia through the architectural drawings? There may be details in them relevant to the Grade 1 listing that would strengthen the submission." Jillian looked at the rolled drawings in the case. "Of course." She and Patricia moved to the larger table by the window, where there was space to unroll the drawings properly. Charlotte and I were left on the sofa. She opened the laptop fully. She turned it so that I could see the screen. The document on the screen was a letter. Handwritten, as I had seen from across the table, on the same stationery as the note in the shoe. The same slightly aged off-white. The same quality of paper that speaks of someone who cared about the materials they used for correspondence. The handwriting was different from the note's careful, deliberate script. This handwriting was more relaxed, more personal, the handwriting of someone writing to a specific person rather than composing a message for unknown future hands. It was addressed to Thomas. Not Dear Mr. Davies, not Dear Thomas Hugh. Simply Thomas, in the way of someone who has known a person long enough that formality would feel like a performance. I read it. It was not a long letter, 2 pages perhaps. The scan included both sides of a single folded sheet. It was dated, which the note had not been, and the date placed it approximately 18 months before Thomas Davies's death. It was signed with a name I did not immediately recognize, a first name only, Margaret, written with the easy informality of the salutation. The letter was, in its essence, a conversation between 2 people who had been working toward something together for a long time and who were now discussing what would happen if one of them was not present to see it through. Not death, specifically. The letter did not mention illness or mortality directly. It discussed, in the careful language of people who understand legal instruments, the succession provisions of the agreement, whether they were sufficient, whether the documentation was complete enough to be actionable by people who hadn't been party to the original discussions, whether the family, specifically, would be able to find what they needed when they needed it. Thomas, the letter said at one point, had expressed concern that Jillian did not know enough to act effectively. The letter writer, Margaret, whoever she was, had disagreed. She had written, "Jillian knows exactly who her father is. That's enough. People find what they need to find when the situation makes it necessary. Trust the instrument and trust the family." I read that sentence twice. Then I read the last paragraph of the letter. And I understood why Charlotte's face had done what it had done. The last paragraph read, I know you worry about leaving things unfinished. I know you've carried the weight of this agreement for years without being able to explain it to the people it will eventually affect. But Thomas, and here the handwriting changed, fractionally, became slightly smaller, more careful, as if the writer had paused and then resumed with greater deliberateness. The work we've done together has been the most important thing in my professional life. Not because of the buildings, though I believe in the buildings entirely, because of what it demonstrated about what people can choose to do when institutions fail. I will make sure the record exists. The agreement will hold. And when the time comes, the Morgan family will be ready, whether they know it or not. Charlotte looked at me. "Who is Margaret?" she said quietly. I looked at the signature. Margaret. A first name, written with complete familiarity in a letter that spoke of a professional partnership of evident depth and duration. A partnership that had involved not merely the practical management of a preservation agreement, but a sustained, serious relationship between two people who clearly trusted each other with things that mattered. "I don't know," I said. And then, because it was true, and because Charlotte deserved honesty rather than management, "I need to find out." The question was not, I want to be clear, one of impropriety. There was nothing in the letter that suggested anything other than a professional relationship of great depth and mutual respect. What there was, what had produced the expression on Charlotte's face and was now producing its equivalent in me, was the recognition that Thomas Hugh Davies had had a significant professional relationship with a woman named Margaret that none of us had known about. Not a secret in the damaging sense, not a concealment of something wrong, but an absence in the record of his life as we had known it, a gap between the person we had understood him to be and the fuller person the letter was showing us. Families contain these absences. I have known this for a long time, in the abstract way of someone who has observed it repeatedly from the professional remove of a courtroom. I knew it differently now. I looked across the room at Gillian, who was unrolling one of the architectural drawings with Patricia, the two of them bending over it with the concentrated attention of professionals examining something they both understood. Gillian, who had spent 23 years with an oak case on a shelf and had never opened it because she hadn't been ready. Who had accepted an official version of her father's professional ending because the grief of losing him had made scrutiny feel like a further loss rather than a way through it. What did she know about Margaret? I closed the laptop gently. "Not yet," I said to Charlotte. "Let's understand more before we bring this to her." Charlotte nodded once. It was the nod of someone who has come to the same conclusion independently and is relieved to have it confirmed. The following morning, I went to the South Wales Municipal Archive. I had telephoned ahead, not to announce myself specifically, but to confirm the opening hours and the access arrangements for the collection Charlotte had been researching. I knew the archive building from my professional life, a Victorian civic building on Park Place, whose exterior had always projected the particular authority of institutions confident in the value of what they housed, and whose interior had always felt, to me, like a place where time moved at a different rate. The reading room, with its long tables and its careful light and the particular smell of properly managed archives, had been part of my professional landscape for 3 decades. I asked the duty archivist about the collection relating to restoration projects in South Wales from the 1990s. She was helpful and thorough. Archivists almost always are, in my experience, because the love of careful information management that brings someone to the profession tends to express itself in exactly the qualities that make a professional encounter genuinely useful. She showed me to the relevant section and explained the cataloging system. I began with the correspondence files. I was looking for Margaret. I had the date of the letter, 18 months before Thomas's death, and I had the reference to the preservation agreement, which gave me a reasonable scope for searching. I worked methodically through the correspondence files relating to the consortium, the agreement, the buildings. The archive held considerably more than Charlotte had been able to access through the remote research processes of her certification program. original correspondence, committee minutes, professional communications, the accumulated paper of a significant heritage preservation effort conducted over nearly a decade. I found her within the first hour, Margaret Elund Howell, a conservation surveyor who had worked extensively in South Wales throughout the 1980s and 1990s, whose professional trajectory I was able to trace through the archive with the systematic pleasure of someone who has always found the reconstruction of a life from documentary evidence one of the most interesting intellectual exercises available. She had been a trustee of the preservation agreement. I found her signature on the original instrument, third in the list, below Thomas's. She had been active in the consortium from its earliest meetings. Her professional correspondence with Thomas, of which the archive held a substantial collection spanning nearly a decade, documented a working relationship of evident intellectual quality. Two people who disagreed productively, who challenged each other's assessments with the confidence of mutual respect, who built something together that neither would have built alone. The correspondence was professional throughout. There was warmth in it, the warmth of people who have worked closely enough together over long enough that a strictly transactional register would feel dishonest. But it was the warmth of colleagues and collaborators and friends, and I was satisfied, reading through it carefully, that this was what it was. What it was also, and what made it significant in the context of what we were trying to understand, was a detailed record of the agreement's operation across nearly a decade. The buildings, the work carried out, the financial structures Charlotte had identified in the municipal accounts, the decisions made about confidentiality and the reasons behind them. The gradual progress toward the formal conclusion of the restoration program, and the planning that both Thomas and Margaret had done against the possibility of that conclusion being disrupted. And in the final months of the correspondence, the letters closest in date to Thomas's death, a shift in tone that was unmistakable even within the professional register. A heightened attention to the documentation. A thoroughness in the record-making that went beyond what the immediate professional requirements demanded. Two people making sure that what they had built together was complete enough and clear enough and findable enough to survive them. Margaret Howell had kept her promise. The record existed. The agreement had held. I found her address through the archive's associated professional directory, a record of heritage professionals who had deposited materials or corresponded with the collection. She was listed with a Cardiff address and a notation that she had retired from active practice 8 years ago. I looked at the address. It was on Pontcanna Street, 12 minutes from Cathedral Road. I wrote it down. Then I found something else. It was in the final folder of the correspondence section, a file that the cataloging system listed simply as miscellaneous, final year, the designation given to documents that don't fit neatly into any other category, and that archivists, being honest about the limits of any organizational system, acknowledge as a necessary catch-all. Inside were several items: a committee minute from the consortium's final meeting before Thomas's death, a professional assessment of one of the buildings dated to the last month of his life, and a sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed, in Thomas's handwriting, to the Morgan family. Not to Gillian specifically, not to any individual, to the Morgan family as a collective, as a unit, as the people who would eventually, he had apparently believed, find their way to this archive and this folder and this envelope. I held it in my hands for a long moment. The duty archivist had been clear about the protocols. Original sealed documents within a collection could not be opened by a researcher without the relevant authority. In this case, as the document was addressed to a specific family and formed part of a private correspondence deposit rather than a public record, access would require either the family's own request or a legal instrument establishing their right to the contents. I was a retired probate judge. I knew exactly what that meant and what it didn't mean. I took out my phone and called Charlotte. She arrived 40 minutes later, still in her professional clothes from the morning's coursework, with the slightly breathless quality of someone who has moved quickly from one place to another because the situation required it. I showed her the envelope. I explained the protocol. She listened, and then she did something I had not anticipated, but that I found, when she did it, entirely correct. She called Jillian. Jillian arrived at the archive at 11:30. She came through the reading room door with the particular quality of stillness she carries into professional environments. The containment of someone who has spent her career working in and around buildings that demand a certain respect from the people who enter them. A stillness that is not rigidity, but is the opposite of carelessness. She looked at the envelope on the table between Charlotte and me. She looked at the handwriting. She sat down. The duty archivist, who had been discreetly present throughout, confirmed that, with the family's identification established and Patricia Reese's legal authorization, which Patricia had provided by email within 20 minutes of Charlotte's call to her, the envelope could be opened in the reading room in the presence of all parties. Jillian opened it. Inside were 2 items. The first was a single sheet of Thomas's professional stationery, with a handwritten note that was brief and direct in the way of someone who has thought carefully about how much to say and has decided that less is more. The second was a folded document, formal, typed, bearing a date and a set of signatures, that Patricia, when Jillian photographed it and sent the image, identified within 5 minutes as a codicil. An addition to Thomas's will, properly witnessed and executed, that had apparently never been located during the original probate process because it had been deposited in the archive rather than held with the primary will documents. The note read, in Thomas's careful hand, I have kept certain things separate from the family record because the family's involvement would have complicated the work at the time it needed to be done. This was not intended as concealment. It was intended as protection of the buildings, of the people who agreed to help without seeking recognition, and of all of you from the weight of something that was mine to carry. The codicil names Margaret Howell as the archive's designated custodian and grants her the authority to act in the consortium's interests until the Morgan family is in a position to do so. She has kept this trust for more than 20 years. I am asking you to find her and to thank her, which is the only recognition she has ever asked for, and which I was not in a position to provide myself. Jillian read it twice. Then she put the note down on the table very gently, in the careful way of someone handling something that requires both physical and emotional care simultaneously. Charlotte was watching her. I was watching her. The reading room was quiet, in the way that good archives are always quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of contained significance. The particular hush of a place where a great deal has been preserved and where preservation itself is understood to be a form of respect. Margaret Howell, Jillian said. Yes, I said. He trusted her with all of it. He trusted her to keep it until you were ready. Jillian looked at the codicil in her hands, at the additional provision to her father's will, properly executed, that had been waiting in a sealed envelope in a municipal archive for 23 years because the original probate process had not known to look here. The probate, she said quietly, with the beginning of something in her voice that was not yet a fully formed thought. Patricia is already looking at it, I said. The codicil will need to be formally admitted. That's a legal process, and it will need to be handled correctly. But the instrument is sound. There may be provisions in it that affect the trust administration, Charlotte said carefully. The forensic accounting perspective, if the codicil names Margaret Howell as custodian with authority to act, and if she has been acting in that capacity for 23 years, there may be a financial record connected to the trust that we haven't seen yet. Jillian looked at her. She's been managing it, Jillian said slowly. All this time. Alone. Apparently so, I said. The room was quiet again, and then Jillian said something that shifted the entire weight of the situation in a direction I had not anticipated. She said, I know who she is. Charlotte and I both looked at her. Not well, she said quickly. I met her once, at a professional event, a heritage conservation seminar in Cardiff, perhaps 12 years ago. She introduced herself. She knew who I was immediately. She said, Jillian stopped. She was looking at the table, at the note in her father's handwriting, at the codicil beside it, at the 23 years of keeping that this woman had done without ever asking for acknowledgement. She said that she had worked with my father and that he had been one of the finest professionals she had known. And I thanked her, and we spoke for a few minutes about his work, and then the seminar began, and we didn't speak again. She paused. I didn't ask her anything, she said. I didn't ask how they'd worked together, or on what, or for how long. I was polite and grateful, and I moved on. Another pause. She must have known at that point everything that was in this envelope. She must have been sitting across from me, knowing all of it, and saying nothing, because my father had asked her to wait until the family was ready. She kept her promise, Charlotte said softly. For 12 more years after that, Jillian said. She saw me at a professional event, and she kept her promise for 12 more years. I thought about the letter in the archive. Margaret Howell's handwriting, writing to Thomas. Trust the instrument and trust the family. She had trusted the family. She had trusted them to find their way here eventually. She had maintained the custodianship alone, quietly, without recognition, for 23 years, waiting for the moment when the Morgan family would be ready. I looked at Charlotte, at my granddaughter, who had walked into a research archive to study financial irregularities for a professional certification program, and had found, underneath the accounting records, a human story of extraordinary quiet loyalty, who had carried a note in her shoe for 11 days because she understood, without being told, that some information needed to be handled with care. At Jillian, at my daughter-in-law, who had kept an oak case on a shelf for 23 years because she hadn't been ready, and who was now sitting in a reading room in Cardiff, holding a codicil to her father's will with the expression of someone who has finally arrived at a place they didn't know they were traveling toward. I thought about what needed to happen before Monday morning. Patricia needed to file the formal objection to the planning application. The Charity Commission needed to be notified of the agreement's reactivation. The Land Registry and the Royal Commission needed to be brought into the submission process. The codicil needed to be formally admitted through the appropriate legal channel, which Patricia could manage, but which would require Jillian's cooperation and documentation. And there was one more thing. One thing that needed to happen before any of the official processes could be fully complete. One thing that Thomas had asked for in his note with the simplicity of a man who understood that some obligations are more important than legal instruments and cannot be discharged through administrative channels. We needed to find Margaret Howell. I had her address, Pontcanna Street, 12 minutes from Cathedral Road. Gillian reached across the table and picked up the note in her father's handwriting. She read it again, the whole of it, slowly, from the beginning. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. She looked at me. "Can we go today?" she said. "Yes," I said. "We can go today." We gathered the documents. The duty archivist carefully photographed everything for the archive's own record before we left, which was correct procedure and which I appreciated. The thoroughness of someone who understands that the way things are documented at the moment of their discovery is as important as the discovery itself. We walked out of the archive into the Cardiff afternoon. The rain had stopped, temporarily, in the way Cardiff rain does, not with any particular conviction, simply pausing, as if considering whether to continue. The streets of Park Place were wet and reflective, and the Victorian buildings along the road had that particular quality I had noticed from the car on Tuesday evening. Darker, more serious, more themselves. Charlotte walked beside me. Jillian walked slightly ahead, which she sometimes does when she is processing something. She moves into space when she is thinking, creates a small buffer of air between herself and other people, which I have always understood as a spatial expression of an interior process rather than a social one. We reached the car. Jillian stopped by the passenger door and looked up at the civic buildings along the street. Their Victorian stone, their established presence, their complete indifference to the administrative complications of the past 23 years. "He saved them," she said. "Whatever the official version said, he saved them." "Yes," I said. "He did." She got into the car. I looked up at the buildings for a moment longer, at the architecture of a city that has been built and rebuilt and preserved and threatened and saved across centuries, that carries its history in its stone the way all old cities do, visibly and invisibly simultaneously. Then I got in and started the engine. Pontcanna Street was 12 minutes away, but it was what happened when we arrived, what Margaret Howell showed us inside a house on a quiet Cardiff street, what she had been keeping that we hadn't known to look for, what she placed in Gillian's hands before she said a single word of greeting that none of us had anticipated. And that changed, in the most specific and irreversible way, what Monday morning was going to mean for every person in this story. Pontcanna Street in the afternoon light of an October Thursday in Cardiff is the kind of street that a city produces when it has had long enough to settle into itself. Not grand, not the architectural assertion of Cathedral Road with its Victorian terraces making their confident case for permanence and proportion. Pontcanna Street is quieter than that, more domestic. The houses sit closer to the pavement, their front gardens small and tended in the way of people who have lived somewhere long enough to understand that what you plant will eventually become part of the neighborhood's character, whether you intend it to or not. There were late roses in several of the gardens, the same stubborn October roses I have in my own garden, holding on past the reasonable season with the particular determination of things that have decided the calendar is not their primary concern. Gillian had said nothing on the drive over, not uncomfortably. She was not withdrawn in the way of someone managing distress. She was simply interior in the way she is when she is doing serious thinking, and I have known her long enough to understand that this is not a state that benefits from interruption. Charlotte sat in the back and looked at her phone, not distractedly, but with the focused attention of someone following a professional thread, cross-referencing something, building a picture from available materials. I parked on the street and we sat for a moment in the car outside the house. Number 41. A mid-terrace Victorian, somewhat smaller than the ones on Cathedral Road, with a bay window at the front and a painted front door. Deep blue, the kind of blue that takes a long time to decide on and that looks correct once chosen. There was a light on inside, visible through the bay window in the October afternoon that was already leaning toward early dark. Someone was home. "Are we expected?" Charlotte asked. "No," I said. A brief silence. "All right," Gillian said. She opened the car door. We walked to the front door. I knocked, not the apologetic knock of someone uncertain of their welcome, but a clear, purposeful knock, the knock of a person with legitimate reason to be on someone's doorstep on a Thursday afternoon in Cardiff. I have learned over many decades that the manner in which you present yourself at a door communicates more than any words that follow it. We waited. The sound of movement inside, unhurried, the movement of someone who lives alone and who has their own relationship with time that doesn't require rushing toward interruptions. Then the door opened. Margaret Elund Howell was, at my estimate, in her early 80s. She was a small woman, compact, upright, with the kind of posture that speaks of a professional lifetime spent in physical environments that rewarded physical awareness. Conservation surveyors spend their careers in buildings, on scaffolding, in roof spaces, navigating the complicated three-dimensional reality of historic structures that don't always behave according to their original drawings. The body remembers this. She had white hair, cut practically, and eyes of a particular clear gray that looked out at us from behind wire-rimmed spectacles with an expression that I can only describe as immediate and complete recognition. She was not surprised to see us. She looked at Gillian first, directly for a long moment, in the way of someone who has been waiting for a specific person and is now confirming that the person who has arrived is the right one. Then she looked at Charlotte, and then at me. She said, "I thought it would be soon. When the planning application came through, I knew the deadline would bring you eventually." Her voice was Welsh in its cadence, the particular music of South Wales English, the slight rise at the end of a phrase that turns statements into something between declaration and question. "Please come in." She stepped back from the door. We went in. The hallway of the house was the hallway of someone who has spent a professional life in the company of buildings and has furnished their own home accordingly, not ostentatiously, not with the self-conscious display of someone performing expertise, but with the natural accumulation of a person whose aesthetic has been shaped by decades of close attention to the built environment. Good proportions, honest materials, a barometer on the wall that looked original to the house, a coat stand of cast iron that had been here long enough to belong. She led us into the sitting room at the front of the house, the room behind the bay window. There was a fire, a real one, a small gas fire in the Victorian fireplace that provided both warmth and the particular quality of light that fires give to rooms, a quality that no electric alternative has ever successfully replicated. There were books on every available surface and a work table near the window that was covered in documents, professional materials I could see from across the room, the organized working spread of someone still actively engaged with something. She gestured to the sofa and the chairs arranged around the fireplace. "Sit down, please, all of you." We sat. She did not sit immediately. She went to the work table and picked up something from the near edge of it, something she had clearly placed there specifically, separately from the rest of the working materials, as if it had been waiting in a position of immediate accessibility. She came back to the fireplace and stood for a moment, holding what she was holding, looking at Jillian. What she was holding was a folder. Not large, A4 size, perhaps an inch thick, the kind of sturdy professional folder used for materials that need to be protected without being archived. It was old. The corners were worn in the way of something that has been handled regularly over a long period, taken out and consulted and replaced many times across many years. She held it out to Jillian, not to me, not to Charlotte. To Jillian specifically, as Thomas's note had implicitly directed, as the person to whom this had always been intended to go. Jillian looked at it for a moment without taking it. Then she took it. Margaret sat down in the chair across from us. She folded her hands in her lap with the composure of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times in private and is now simply inhabiting it. "Your father gave me that folder in the last month of his life," she said. "He asked me to keep it until you came, or until circumstances made keeping it impossible. I've been keeping it for 23 years. A pause. Open it when you're ready. I'll answer whatever questions come after." Jillian held the folder in both hands. She looked at it the way she had looked at the oak case on the coffee table the previous evening, with the particular attention of someone arriving at a threshold and taking the moment before crossing it seriously. Then she opened it. I watched her face. The first thing inside was a photograph. Jillian took it out and held it, and I saw something move across her expression that I had not seen before. Not grief, not surprise, but something that was the compound of both of those things, and something else beneath them that I could not immediately name. She held the photograph for a long moment, then she turned it so that Charlotte and I could see. It was a group photograph. 5 people standing in front of a building, the Edwardian building on Westgate Street. I recognized it from the architectural drawings in the oak case, though in the photograph it was in worse condition than the drawings showed. Scaffolding visible on one side, the stonework showing the particular patchy deterioration of a structure that has been neglected and is in the early stages of being saved. The 5 people were in professional clothes, outdoor clothes, the practical attire of people who have been working in a building rather than visiting it. They were looking at the camera with the particular expression of people who are in the middle of something important and have paused to record the fact. Thomas Hugh Davies was on the left of the group. He was perhaps 50 in the photograph, younger than I had known him, his hair darker but recognizably himself in every particular that matters, The posture, the directness of his gaze, the expression of someone completely present in what they are doing. Margaret Howell was beside him, clearly identifiable even at 30 years remove as the woman now sitting across from us in the firelit sitting room. The other three were the remaining trustees. On the back of the photograph, in Thomas's handwriting, "First site visit, Westgate Street. The beginning of something worth doing." Jillian turned the photograph back and held it for a moment longer. Then she placed it carefully on the arm of the sofa beside her and looked at the folder again. What followed was an hour that I find, even now, difficult to describe with the precision I would like to bring to it. Not because it was chaotic, it was the opposite of chaotic. It unfolded with a quiet, measured gravity, the gravity of a thing settling into its proper position after a long time of being held at an angle. Margaret spoke, and we listened, and the documents in the folder moved between our hands, and the fire maintained its small, steady warmth, and outside the October afternoon became the October evening, and Cardiff went about its business beyond the blue front door. Margaret told us the full history of the consortium from the beginning. Not the administrative history. We had that from the archive, from the correspondence files and the committee minutes and the financial records. The human history. The story that the documents recorded incompletely because documents record decisions and outcomes, but not the conversations that produce them, not the relationships that make sustained collaborative work possible, not the texture of what it actually feels like to spend nearly a decade trying to save things that matter, because the institutions responsible for saving them are unable or unwilling to do so. The consortium had begun, she told us, at a professional gathering in Cardiff in the late 1980s. A seminar on heritage protection in Wales, attended by the range of professionals whose work intersected with listed buildings: architects, engineers, surveyors, conservation specialists. There had been a particular discussion, frank to the point of being uncomfortable, about the gap between the statutory protection that listed status was supposed to provide and the practical reality of buildings whose owners lacked resources and whose regulatory oversight was thinly stretched. Several of the people in that room had been watching specific buildings deteriorate for years, while the administrative machinery moved at a rate entirely incompatible with the urgency of structural decline. Thomas had been one of the people in that room. Margaret had been another. After the seminar, 5 of them had stayed behind. Not by arrangement. It had happened in the organic way of people who recognize that they are thinking the same thing and that leaving the room would mean abandoning a conversation that needed to continue. They had talked for 2 hours in an emptying conference room while the Cardiff evening assembled itself outside, and by the end of that conversation, they had the outline of what would become the preservation agreement. It had taken 18 months to formalize. The legal structure required careful construction. Patricia had confirmed as much from the document itself. The funding model required the kind of professional generosity that is easier to describe than to actually implement, because it meant giving substantial quantities of skilled work for nothing, or nearly nothing, in the knowledge that the recognition that normally accompanies significant professional contribution would not be forthcoming. The confidentiality provision, the decision to keep the agreement's existence and operation from the public record, had been the most debated element. It had been Thomas's proposal ultimately, and it had been adopted not because the others were entirely comfortable with invisibility, but because they understood the reasoning and trusted his judgment. The reasoning was this: several of the buildings the consortium proposed to work on were owned by or associated with public bodies whose statutory obligations regarding listed structures significantly exceeded their practical capacity to fulfill them. Public acknowledgement of the consortium's intervention would have created institutional difficulties for those bodies, difficulties that might have generated political pressure to restructure the very funding mechanisms whose inadequacy had made the consortium necessary in the first place. Thomas had argued and eventually persuaded that the work should simply be done quietly, without the kind of public profile that would complicate the institutional landscape and potentially compromise future cooperation. He had been right, Margaret told us. Not right in the sense of having been infallible. There had been moments over the years when she had disagreed with specific decisions, and she said this directly, without softening it, in the way of someone reporting fact rather than managing an impression, but right in the fundamental strategic assessment. The work had proceeded, the buildings had been saved, the institutional relationships had remained intact. And the people whose livelihoods and professional standings had depended on those relationships had been protected from the kind of public scrutiny that might have made their situations considerably more difficult. Jillian listened to all of this without interrupting. She sat with the folder open in her hands, the photograph on the sofa beside her, the folder's other contents partially visible but not yet examined. Her expression was the expression I had tried to name when she first opened the folder and found the photograph, the compound of grief and surprise and something underneath them both. I understood it now. It was recognition. The specific recognition of hearing a description of a person you loved and understanding, perhaps for the first time at full resolution, who that person actually was. Not a revised version of them, not a corrected version. The complete version, the one that had always existed, that had simply been only partially visible from the angle available to you. Charlotte had been making notes on her phone throughout Margaret's account, quietly, without making the note-taking prominent, in the way of a professional gathering information, without allowing the gathering to interrupt the flow of what is being given. At a certain point, she looked up and asked Margaret, carefully, about the financial structures. The accounts Charlotte had been tracing in the municipal records, the pattern of transfers recorded as standard project expenditure. Margaret confirmed what Charlotte had already concluded. The transfers had been recorded as they had been recorded, as standard project expenditure in the relevant accounts, because recording them correctly as charitable distributions would have made the agreement visible in the public financial record, which would have defeated the confidentiality provision. Someone in the relevant administrative offices had known about the arrangement and had made the accounting decision that allowed it to remain invisible. That person had retired many years ago and had, Margaret believed, never spoken publicly about their role. Could that create a legal problem now? Charlotte asked. For the objection process, for the reactivation of the agreement. Margaret looked at her with the clear gray assessment that I was coming to recognize as her natural mode of engagement. Direct, without judgment, simply evaluative. That's exactly the right question, she said. And the answer is that it depends on how it's characterized. The financial management was unorthodox. It was not fraudulent. The intent was protective, the sums were correctly applied to their stated purpose, and no individual benefited personally. Your legal counsel will need to be explicit about this in the submission, but I don't believe it compromises the objection. Charlotte looked at me. I gave a small nod of agreement with Margaret's assessment. Patricia would frame it correctly. She was too experienced not to. Margaret stood and went to the work table. She came back with a second folder, thicker than the first and newer, the accumulation of more recent years. She placed it on the table between us. This is my record of the agreement's administration since Thomas's death, she said. 23 years of it. The building's condition assessments, updated annually. The Charity Commission correspondence, the codicil administration, the communication with the surviving trustees. 2 of the original 5 are still living. I've kept everything current because I believed the moment would come when it would need to be presented, and I didn't want to hand you something that was complete up to 23 years ago and empty since. I looked at the folder. At 23 years of solitary custodianship, maintained with professional rigor, without recognition, without the ordinary sustaining acknowledgement that most professional work receives as a matter of course. A retired surveyor in her early 80s, in a house on Pontcanna Street with a blue front door and late roses in the garden, updating condition assessments for buildings she had helped save decades ago, and continuing to file correspondence with the Charity Commission because a man she had worked alongside had asked her to hold the trust until the family was ready. "Margaret," I said. She looked at me. "Why?" I asked. Not unkindly, not as a challenge, simply as a question that deserved to be asked directly by someone who was genuinely asking it. She considered it for a moment. Because the work was worth doing, she said. That was always the answer Thomas gave when anyone asked why he had taken on something that gave him no public credit. The work was worth doing. The buildings were worth saving. The families and institutions connected to them were worth protecting. She paused. I believed him. I still believe him. That has made it simple, in the practical sense, even when it wasn't simple in other ways. Gillian looked up from the folder she had been holding throughout. She had not opened it further. She had been sitting with the photograph on one side of her and the closed folder in her hands, and I had not rushed her because some things require exactly the time they take. But now she looked at Margaret with an expression that had finally resolved into something clear. The seminar, she said. 12 years ago, in Cardiff. Margaret met her eyes. Yes. You knew who I was immediately. Yes. And you said nothing about any of this. No, Margaret said. I didn't. Why not then, after 19 years? Margaret looked at her steadily. Because you were at a professional event, and you were composed and capable and clearly in the middle of a distinguished career. And I looked at you and I thought, she's not ready yet, not because you weren't strong enough, but because the right moment hadn't come. The planning application hadn't been filed. The circumstances that would make this actionable hadn't aligned. She paused. Thomas trusted the instrument and trusted the family. I trusted them both. Gillian held Margaret's gaze for a long moment. Then she opened the folder. The remaining contents were, in their way, the most extraordinary part of what the afternoon had given us. Not because they were legally significant. Patricia, when Charlotte photographed them and sent the images, confirmed that their legal content was supportive but not essential, given what the archive and the Oak case had already provided. Their significance was not administrative. They were letters, personal ones. 6 of them, written by Thomas over the years of the consortium's operation, kept by Margaret not as professional correspondence, but as something else, as the record of a friendship, of a working relationship that had become, over nearly a decade, the kind of bond that forms between people who have built something serious together and who have discovered in each other qualities that serious work reveals. The letters were addressed to her, written in the relaxed personal hand I had seen in the archive's final folder, and they were about the work, but also about what the work meant. The buildings in the abstract, but also the specific reasons a structural engineer from Merthyr Tydfil cared so deeply about them that he was prepared to do the most important work of his professional life without acknowledgement. Gillian read them one by one, slowly, in the firelit sitting room, while Charlotte and I and Margaret sat quietly around her. In the 3rd letter, Thomas wrote about Gillian. He wrote about watching his daughter develop as a conservation architect and recognizing in her professional choices the same instinct that had driven his own. The instinct toward things worth preserving, toward the patient, technically demanding work of keeping the past inhabitable for the present. He wrote that he had sometimes wondered whether to tell her about the consortium and had decided against it, not from secrecy, but from the particular parental instinct that wants a child to find their own path to the things that matter rather than arrive at them through the parent's direction. He wrote, "She will find her own buildings, her own reasons. I don't need her to know about mine until she's built enough of her own to understand them fully." Gillian's voice, when she read that section aloud, she had begun reading sections aloud without being asked, in the natural way of someone who finds that words need to be spoken to be fully real, was steady, entirely steady. The steadiness of someone who has moved through something and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. In the 5th letter, written in the final months of his life, Thomas wrote about the succession provision in the agreement. He wrote about the care he had taken with the documentation, the codicil, the deposit in the archive, the folder with Margaret, the Oak case in Gillian's keeping, the multiple points of access, the redundancy of the record-keeping, the deliberate distribution of the pieces so that no single loss could make the whole irretrievable. He wrote, "I am building this the way I build everything, for the long term, for the people who come after." And in the final letter, the last one, written with the slightly altered quality of a man whose physical energy is diminished but whose mental clarity remains entirely intact, he wrote one paragraph that Margaret had kept turned face down in the folder, separate from the others, as if she had decided that this one needed to be encountered last. Gillian found it. She turned it over. She read it. She was quiet for a long moment after. Then she said, in a voice that was barely above ordinary conversation, but that carried the weight of everything the afternoon had given us, "He says thank you. To you. To Margaret." She looked up. "He says, tell Gillian, when the time comes, that the buildings were always secondary. The primary thing was demonstrating that people can choose integrity when the structures around them fail to require it. That is the lesson I most want her to take from all of this. Not what we built, how we chose to build it." The fire made its small sound. The Cardiff evening was complete now outside the blue door. The street was quiet with the particular quiet of a residential neighborhood that has settled into its evening rhythm, domestic and continuous and entirely indifferent to the remarkable thing that had just happened inside number 41. Margaret was looking at Gillian with the expression of someone who has waited a very long time to see a particular thing happen, and is now simply witnessing it, without urgency, without comment, with the peaceful attention of completion. Charlotte set down her phone. She had stopped making notes. There was nothing left to note in the professional sense. Everything that needed to be captured had been captured. What remained was not information. It was something that doesn't reduce to a file or a folder or a legal submission. I thought about Patricia Reese, who at that moment was in her study in Cardiff, preparing the formal objection that would go to the planning authority on Monday morning. I thought about Harold Croft in Lunenburg, a world away and entirely unconnected, who had said about Robert Bennett, he didn't want the credit, he just wanted it to work. I thought about the way certain qualities recur across entirely separate lives, the preference for substance over recognition, the willingness to carry invisible weight for the sake of something worth carrying it for, the particular courage of people who build things knowing they may not be present when the building is understood. We left Pontcanna Street at 6:30. Margaret walked us to the door. She and Gillian stood on the threshold for a moment. The blue door opened behind them, the street quiet and dark, the late roses in the small front garden faintly visible in the light from the hallway. They looked at each other with the particular look of people who have just shared something significant and are acknowledging it without making it into a ceremony. Gillian said, "Will you come? On Monday morning, when we file the objection." Margaret looked at her. I wasn't sure whether to ask. "I'm asking," Gillian said. Margaret nodded once. Then yes. We drove back to Cathedral Road through the Cardiff evening, the wet streets and the lit windows and Butte Park invisible in the dark to our left, present as it always is, even when you can't see it. Gillian sat in the front seat and looked out at the city and didn't speak, which was right. Charlotte sat in the back, which was also right. I drove the 12 minutes home and parked, and we went inside into the warmth of the hallway with its Victorian floor tiles, and I put the kettle on because some things are simply what you do. The days between Thursday and Monday had their own particular quality. Patricia filed preliminary documentation with the planning authority on Friday morning, establishing the family's standing and signaling the formal objection to come. The Charity Commission confirmed the agreement's registration status in writing. Active, dormant, now formally notified of reactivation proceedings. The Land Registry and the Royal Commission were contacted and provided supporting assessments with a speed that reflected, Patricia told me, the seriousness with which both bodies regarded the Grade 1 listing at risk. Charlotte completed her certification assessment during this period. Submitted on Saturday morning, early, having spent Friday evening working through the final elements with the focused efficiency of someone who has been reminded, by proximity to the real thing, why the technical skills she is building actually matter. She messaged me after submitting. Done. Now back to the important work. Gillian spent the weekend reviewing the architectural drawings from the oak case and preparing a conservation architect's technical assessment of the buildings named in the agreement, a document that Patricia incorporated into the objection submission as professional evidence of the structure's significance and the impact of the proposed development on their listed status. She worked at the table in my dining room on Saturday and Sunday, the drawings spread around her, with the complete absorption of someone doing work they are exactly qualified to do, and that they understand, in a way they haven't always understood it, to matter beyond its immediate professional scope. Monday morning arrived with the particular clarity that Cardiff occasionally produces after a run of rain. The sky high and blue, the streets washed clean, the light direct and without ambiguity. I stood at the long window of my first-floor bedroom and watched Butte Park in the early morning light, the trees in their late October state, the last of the color, the shape of the park asserting itself in a way that the gray weeks had softened. We gathered at Cathedral Road at 8 o'clock, Patricia, Gillian, Charlotte, Margaret Howell, and I. Patricia had the submission prepared. 83 pages of legal argument, professional assessment, historical documentation, and authenticated records, the accumulated evidence of 23 years of careful custodianship, and 3 intensive days of legal preparation combined into a formal objection that she described, with the measured confidence of someone who has done this work for 4 decades, as the strongest heritage protection submission she had prepared. We drove to the Planning Authority offices together. The submission was filed at 9:47 on Monday morning. The planning officer who received it looked at the documentation package with the particular expression of someone encountering something considerably more substantial than they had been expecting. He confirmed receipt formally. He told us the application would be referred for extended review in light of the objection's scope and the registered heritage protection instrument it cited. He said that a decision would not be forthcoming before the review was complete. We walked out into the Monday morning Cardiff light. Margaret stood for a moment on the pavement outside the planning offices, looking up at the buildings along the street, not searching for anything, simply looking, the way people look at things they have spent a long time caring about when they finally have the luxury of looking at them with the knowledge that something has been done. Gillian stood beside her. Charlotte stood beside me. The 4 of us were quiet for a moment on the Cardiff pavement, in the ordinary Monday morning movement of the city going about its week, the buses and the cyclists and the people with their coffee cups and their particular purposeful gaits, and none of it aware that anything unusual had just happened in the planning offices behind us. That was, I thought, entirely appropriate. Thomas Hugh Davies would have found it appropriate. The final review, when it came 6 weeks later, refused the planning application as submitted. The applicants were invited to resubmit with modifications that preserved the listed structures in their current form. The charitable preservation agreement was formally reinstated with Gillian Morgan as lead trustee, Charlotte Morgan as financial trustee, and Margaret Alund Howell as honorary custodian, a role created specifically for her, named in the reinstatement documentation at Gillian's insistence. The 2 surviving original trustees attended the reinstatement signing, held in the reading hall of the National Library of Wales. It was not a ceremony. There was no agenda in the formal sense, no speeches, no prescribed order of events. It was simply a gathering of people who had been connected to something important and who sat around a table in a room built for the keeping of significant things and signed their names to documents that made the connection official. I sat at that table, and I thought about the reading hall itself. That extraordinary building in Aberystwyth where Wales has kept its written record for more than a century. The formal institutional expression of the belief that what a culture produces in language and image and document is worth preserving with the full seriousness of public commitment. I thought about what it meant that this was where Thomas's agreement was finally being completed. Not the Cardiff civic offices, not a solicitor's meeting room, not an administrative building of any kind. A library, a place built for exactly the kind of patient, permanent keeping that the agreement had represented from its beginning. Charlotte signed last. She looked at her signature on the document for a moment after she set the pen down. The signature of a forensic accountant in the first year of her professional career, signing a document that connected her to a story that had begun before she was born, and that she had found, improbably and necessarily, in the financial records of a certification case study. She looked up at me. I thought about what Thomas had written to Margaret about Jillian. She will find her own buildings, her own reasons. He had been right about Jillian. He had, in a way he couldn't have foreseen, also been right about Charlotte. The sunrise over Cardiff Bay came on a morning in late November, 3 days after the reinstatement signing. Jillian had suggested it, had sent a message the evening before saying simply, "Bay tomorrow morning, early. Both of you, if you can." I could, and Charlotte could, and we drove down through the sleeping city in the pre-dawn dark and parked near the waterfront and walked out onto the esplanade in the cold that comes off the Bristol Channel in November like a reminder that the year is finishing. The bay was in that state of pre-dawn stillness that large bodies of water achieve in the dark. Not quiet exactly, but self-contained, concentrated, the sound of it present, but the sight of it reduced to the lights reflecting on the surface, the shapes of the buildings along the waterfront, the particular quality of dark that is not quite dark because light is coming. Then it came. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical suddenness of a sunrise in a film. The way actual dawn works, incrementally, the sky changing color by almost imperceptible degrees, the water beginning to hold the light rather than simply reflecting the artificial sources around it, the shapes of things becoming specific as the general dark gives way to the general blue, and the general blue gives way to the first clear light of a November morning in South Wales. Jillian and Charlotte walked together along the esplanade. I walked a little behind them, not from exclusion, not from age, but from the instinct of someone who has learned that certain things are best witnessed from a slight remove. They walked close together, their voices not carrying to where I was, talking in the low, continuous way of people who have a great deal to say and are taking the time it requires. I watched them. I thought about Thomas Hugh Davies, who had built something and left it in a brass-keyed oak case for a daughter he trusted to find it when she was ready. I thought about Margaret Howell, who had kept a folder for 23 years on a work table in a house on Pontcanna Street because she had believed in the instrument and in the family. I thought about Charlotte, who had found a financial irregularity in a certification case study and had followed it to a note in her shoe, and had carried that note for 11 days with the careful instinct of someone who understood, without being told, that some information requires handling before it can be shared. I thought about the buildings on Westgate Street and Charles Street and wherever the medieval structure stood, still standing, all of them. Their Grade 1 and Grade 2 starred listings now actively defended by a reinstated charitable instrument with 3 new trustees who understood what they were protecting and why. I thought about what Thomas had written in his last letter. Not what we built, but how we chose to build it. Families are not always healed by discovering new truths. I had believed this for most of my professional life, watching from the bench as families navigated the legal aftermath of loss. I had seen families torn apart by truths, by discoveries, by the revelation of things that had been kept, intentionally or accidentally, from the people most affected by them. What I understood differently now, what the Oak case and the archive and the Blue Door on Pontcanna Street and this November morning over Cardiff Bay had given me, was that healing depends less on the nature of the truth discovered than on the quality of the people who discover it. Thomas had built something worth finding. Jillian had kept it safe without knowing she was keeping it. Charlotte had found it through the patient, technical work of following a thread. Margaret had held the trust for 23 years with the quiet fidelity of someone who understood that some promises are more important than recognition. And here, on a Cardiff Bay esplanade in the early light of a November morning, the people connected to all of this were simply walking together. That was enough. That was, I found, more than enough. If this story reached you, if something in it held you, whether it was the note in the shoe, or Margaret's 23 years at her work table, or Thomas's letter about choosing integrity when the structures around us fail to require it, then this is the moment I'd ask you to do something small. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because the stories we tell here are chosen for exactly the reason this one was. They are the ones where ordinary people do quietly extraordinary things and leave behind something worth finding. Leave a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Was it the oak case waiting on its shelf for 23 years? Was it Charlotte and the note she carried in her shoe? Was it the sunrise over the bay? I read every word that comes back, and the conversation that happens in the comments is part of what makes these stories complete. The next one is waiting, and I think you'll want to be here when it arrives.